Riley Harper's fingers drummed the counter in rhythmic impatience, the worn wood beneath his hand creaking in protest. A low hum of conversation buzzed around him, but his eyes were locked on the pot of freshly brewed Racoon coffee, the steam curling up in lazy tendrils. His bar was quiet tonight, too quiet. Something in the air felt off, like the calm before a storm. But he wasn't worried. Not yet. The old bar, buried beneath the crumbling remains of New York City, had been his home for the past 5 years. The glass was cracked, the walls marked with grime, and the faint smell of burned toast lingered in the air, but it was his place. The underground haven where soldiers, survivors, and resistance fighters came to hide, drink, and talk about things that didn't matter anymore. Tonight, though, it wasn't the usual crowd. No, tonight something far bigger was happening. A knock on the door echoed through the room, sharp and unexpected. Riley straightened, his hand hovering over the handle of the coffee pot. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "Riley Harper?" came a low voice, rough with urgency. "We need to talk." Riley wiped his hands on the front of his worn jacket, his voice casual, though his heart beat faster. "Yeah, you found me. Don't get many visitors down here. Come on in." The door creaked open, and 2 figures stepped in. The first, a tall, wiry man with dark, unshaven features, was familiar, Lena, an old contact from the resistance. The second, however, was new, a woman whose sharp eyes and military-grade stance marked her as someone dangerous. She wore a faded military jacket, patched up from years of battle. Lena wasted no time, her voice urgent. "We've got a mission, Harper. A big one. It's your coffee. It's the only thing that might save us now." Riley raised an eyebrow, taking a slow sip from his mug. "My coffee?" He had brewed hundreds of gallons of it over the years, and it was infamous for one thing: no one could really explain how it worked. It didn't just keep you awake, it did something else. Something unpredictable. But save the world? That was new. "You'll want to sit down," Lena continued, her eyes glinting with intensity. "We've intercepted intel from the highest levels of the Galician Command. They're planning their final push. And you, Riley Harper, are going to deliver a batch of your Racoon coffee straight to them." "Galician High Command?" Riley repeated, setting his cup down with a deliberate clink. "You're out of your mind. I brew coffee, not peace treaties." Lena's gaze hardened. "This is no joke. We've been fighting them for years. Earth's about to fall, and we need to make the Galaxians doubt themselves. They've been drinking our coffee, high-ranking officers. And we think it's getting to them. Something about it, something strange. They're weakening, Riley." Riley took another sip of his coffee, the bitterness of the dark brew cutting through his thoughts. "I'm still not following. They drink my coffee, and they start seeing the light? Is that it?" "You don't get it," Lena snapped. "You're not just delivering coffee. You're delivering a message. The Galaxians think they're superior. That they've got all the power. But one sip of your brew? We think it cracks their perfect little minds wide open. They start questioning everything." Riley leaned back against the counter, fingers tracing the edge of the coffee pot. "So, let me get this straight. You want me to stroll into their headquarters, pour them a cup, and hope their entire empire comes crashing down because they've had a little too much caffeine?" He chuckled, the sound dark. "And you think that's going to work?" "Yeah, I do." The woman spoke up for the first time. Her voice was cold, clipped, but there was something in her eyes that Riley couldn't quite place. "We've seen it happen. Troops defecting. Commanders suddenly talking about peace with humanity. You've got something powerful, Harper. And we need to use it." Riley's eyes narrowed. "And you're sure the Galaxians will take it?" "I'm not exactly on their Christmas card list. I don't even know what's in the stuff half the time." Lena stepped forward, her expression grim. "We don't have a choice. We've tried everything else. They're too powerful, too smart. But your coffee? No one understands it. Not even the aliens. That's why we're counting on you." Riley's heart thudded in his chest. He knew what they were asking. It was madness, but madness was what had kept them alive this long. He looked at the pot of coffee, the dark liquid swaying in its glass carafe like it held the weight of the world. This wasn't about saving Earth. This was about giving humanity a fighting chance. Well, hell, he muttered, setting down his mug. If I'm going to risk my neck, I might as well go out with a bang. I'll do it. Lena's expression softened, though the urgency never left her voice. Good. You'll leave tomorrow. The Galician fleet is about to launch, and we need this done before they strike the final blow. Don't get your hopes up, Riley warned. This is one shot. If this coffee does what we think it does, it'll be a disaster for them. If not, well, then Earth's gonna be a whole lot quieter. We'll take the risk, Lena replied, her voice steady. We don't have another option. Riley nodded, his mind already spinning through the logistics. The risks. The plan. The impossibility of it all. But the weirdness of the situation was nothing new. What he didn't expect, though, was what he had to do next: get past the Galician defenses, waltz into their command center, and make them drink the coffee. For a moment, Riley just stared at the pot. He knew there was no turning back. There was something about this coffee, something beyond the caffeine, beyond the weird feeling it gave people. It changed minds. Whether that was a blessing or a curse, he didn't know yet. I'll get the brew ready, Riley said finally, wiping his hands on his jacket. If the Galaxians want a taste, I'll make sure they get the best damn cup of coffee they've ever had. As Lena and the woman turned to leave, Riley's eyes followed them, his fingers tapping once more on the counter. He didn't have the luxury of doubt anymore. The Resistance had placed their trust in him, and somehow, in a world that didn't make sense, that meant something. He stood alone in the dim light of his bar, the weight of Earth's fate pressing down on his shoulders. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin. The humming of Riley's ship filled the otherwise silent cabin as he drifted through the void of space, his hands steady on the controls. Outside the viewport, Earth was a distant blue marble, but the real focus of his attention was the Galician space station, looming ahead like a massive, metallic spider. It had been years since the Galaxians had invaded, their relentless technological superiority crushing Earth's defenses one city at a time. Now they were close to their final conquest. And Riley was about to bring them a taste of something no alien had ever experienced. He let out a slow breath, the familiar scent of his brew still lingering in the air, its rich, earthy aroma a reminder of what had brought him here. His coffee. Ridiculous as it seemed, it was humanity's last chance, a last-ditch effort to break the grip of an invincible enemy. And it was up to him, a grizzled former Marine turned coffee barista, to deliver it. A few hours earlier, Riley had made the final batch. There had been no fanfare, no heroic moment. Just a quiet stirring of the grounds, a careful pour, and a whispered promise to himself. Make it count. He reached down to the seat beside him and ran his fingers over the sealed container. The coffee was in there. The Racoon coffee. The one that had already shown itself capable of shaking the most stoic of minds. But today, it would face the biggest test of all. The Galician command room was sterile and cold, a stark contrast to Riley's shabby bar. The walls were smooth, metallic, and devoid of any warmth, and the only light came from harsh overhead strips that buzzed like the hum of a dying insect. It felt more like a tomb than a place of command, and Riley could feel the tension thick in the air as he was escorted through the doors by two silent Galician guards. They didn't speak to him. Not a word. But that didn't bother him. Riley had learned long ago that actions spoke louder than words, and the Galaxians were about to get a crash course in the kind of disruption humans were capable of. At the far end of the room, seated at a long, angular table, were the Galician High Command. Strax, the imposing reptilian commander, sat in the center, flanked by his officers, each one more alien than the last, their eyes sharp, calculating, and distant. Their superior minds were the driving force behind the Galician Empire's reign, their intellect unmatched. But none of them had ever tasted Riley's coffee. Strax's gaze settled on him as Riley approached, his cold eyes narrowing. Human, he rasped, his voice a deep, guttural rumble. "You are the one who claims to have a beverage that can alter minds?" Riley felt a slight shiver crawl down his spine, but he wasn't afraid. This was the moment. "That's right," Riley replied, his voice steady. He placed the container on the table with a small thud, the faint smell of coffee already wafting through the room, despite the sterile surroundings. He opened it slowly, theatrically, as though the very act of unveiling it was a revelation. "One sip and you'll understand why Earth's not going down without a fight." The Galaxians exchanged looks, their reptilian heads tilting in synchronization. To them, coffee was a primitive human indulgence, a lowly distraction for weaker minds. But Riley didn't expect them to understand. "Not yet." Strax waved a hand dismissively. "Proceed," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "We will humor you, human. But do not waste our time." Riley set a cup down in front of Strax, his hands steady despite the weight of what was happening. He could feel the intensity of the room, the pressure bearing down on him. This was no ordinary coffee. It wasn't just a drink, it was the last hope for Earth, wrapped in caffeine and mystery. The Galaxians didn't wait. Strax lifted the cup, his long, clawed fingers wrapping around the porcelain with an unsettling grace. He raised it to his lips, the room's silence almost suffocating as the alien commander took his first sip. Riley watched, his pulse quickening. He had seen the effects before, on humans, on aliens, but this was different. The Galaxians had never faced it. For a moment, nothing happened. Strax simply stared at the cup, as though trying to decipher its contents. But then, his expression shifted, just slightly, but it was enough. He blinked, and his pupils contracted, narrowing sharply. Then, without warning, his posture stiffened, his breathing growing heavier. His hand trembled as he set the cup back down, a faint hint of confusion crossing his features. The other officers were watching now, their gazes flicking from Strax to each other. One by one, they reached for their cups, their movements slower than before, almost as if they were unsure of the next step. "What is this?" Strax growled, his voice unsteady. The once imposing commander sounded human. Riley couldn't help the small grin that tugged at his lips. "It's just coffee," he said, watching as the other officers took their first sips. "But it's not just any coffee." The tension in the room was palpable. The Galaxian officers were all visibly struggling with the effects, their confident postures crumbling as the first wave hit. They began speaking, but not in their usual commanding tones. Their voices were softer, unsure. One officer, a tall, angular alien with pale green skin, looked at Strax and spoke in an almost apologetic tone. "Commander, this reminds me of something. Something human." His voice faltered as though the very memory of it was foreign to him. Strax's clawed fingers dug into the table, his breathing ragged. "This is absurd," he muttered, trying to regain control, but his gaze kept darting around the room, looking at his officers as though seeing them for the first time. His mental fortress, forged over millennia of conquest, was beginning to crack. Another officer, this one with silver scales, spoke in a voice tinged with uncertainty. It's warmth. It's familiar." Riley's smile grew wider, though he kept it restrained. He knew what was happening. The coffee was working its magic, slipping through their defenses like a silent invader. He had seen it before, the way the drink broke through the hardest of exteriors, leaving the drinker raw and open. The commander, struggling to maintain his authority, slammed a fist on the table. "Enough! What is the meaning of this, human? This is not how it was supposed to go." Riley's eyes glinted with amusement. "You asked for it, Strax. You asked to see why humans fight so hard?" Another officer, visibly sweating, stood and began pacing the room, muttering to himself. What is this feeling? It's too much to process." Riley watched in silence as the high command of the Galaxian Empire began to crumble, their sharp minds now struggling to make sense of a force they couldn't understand. It wasn't just the coffee. It was what it had done to them, the realization that they weren't infallible, that they were vulnerable. This was only the beginning. The metallic hum of the Galician command room had shifted. Where there had once been the cold, calculated confidence of the high command, now there was something else: confusion. Fear. Riley could see it in their eyes, the once imposing figures now stumbling through their thoughts as the effects of the coffee continued to unravel them. What had been a battle of superior intellect and strategy was now a battle of wills, and Riley was suddenly a player in a game he never intended to join. Thrax, the commander, had his claws dug into the table, his breathing labored. He had gone from calm to erratic, his mind no longer in control of his body. It was the coffee, the Racoon brew, that was doing this. The Galaxians were used to mind-altering substances, but nothing like this. They had no frame of reference for what they were experiencing. "What is happening to us?" Thrax growled, his voice shaking. He had stopped addressing Riley, instead speaking to his officers, his words filled with the disbelief of someone who had lost control of everything they knew. "This is impossible." Riley's gaze flicked from the commander to the others in the room. One officer, a tall figure with silvery eyes, had collapsed into his seat, clutching his head as if he were in pain. Another, a green-skinned alien with a sleek, armored exoskeleton, was pacing back and forth, muttering to himself in rapid, disjointed speech. The once pristine, intimidating assembly had descended into chaos, and Riley stood in the center, a calm island amidst the storm. "They're breaking," Riley muttered under his breath. He took a step closer to Thrax, watching as the commander tried and failed to regain his composure. "You did this," Thrax hissed, his gaze narrowing with what was left of his authority. "You've poisoned us." Riley didn't flinch. "I didn't poison anyone. I gave you a taste of humanity. Something you'll never understand, no matter how hard you try. You think this will break us?" Thrax spat, his voice thick with fury. "We are the superior species. You cannot defeat us with your trivialities." Riley shook his head slowly, the edge of his voice growing sharp. "I'm not here to defeat you. I'm here to make you think. For the first time in your entire existence, to make you question your own superiority. To make you feel what you've done to this planet." The room fell silent, the Galician officers staring at him in confusion, but also in something deeper, a flicker of doubt. Riley wasn't sure if it was the coffee or the weight of his words, but something was shifting. The Galaxians weren't used to the emotional complexity of humans. They weren't prepared for it. They didn't know how to process it. One officer, the silver-eyed one, suddenly stood up, his body rigid. "It's the memories," he said, his voice strangely calm for the panic that had gripped the others. I see them. The human memories. The ones we've erased, the ones we've ignored." Riley's eyes flicked to him, surprised by the sudden clarity in the officer's voice. "What do you mean?" "The memories of Earth," the officer continued, his tone more reflective than it had been moments before. "The beauty. The diversity. The history. All the things we destroyed. I see them. All of them. It's overwhelming." The green-skinned officer stopped pacing and turned, his voice trembling. "We were so certain we were invincible. That nothing could stop us." He swallowed hard. "But now He paused, as if struggling to find words. "Now I feel small." Riley's lips twitched. It was working. He could see it, feel it in the room. The Galaxians, for all their power, were beginning to unravel. The coffee had done more than just disrupt their minds. It was disrupting their entire worldview. The foundation of their empire was built on the idea of unquestioned supremacy, and in just a few sips, that belief was cracking. Thrax slammed his fist on the table, his voice rising with fury. "Enough! We are superior! You are insignificant. Nothing more than an infestation on a worthless planet." But the fury wasn't what it had been. There was a tremor in the commander's voice now, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. His confidence was slipping, piece by piece, and Riley knew the coffee had done its work. "You're wrong," Riley said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension. "You're not superior. You've just been lucky. You've never faced something like humanity. The words landed with the weight of a sledgehammer. The Galaxians exchanged uneasy glances, but none of them dared speak. For the first time in the history of their empire, they were unsure. And for Riley, that was all that mattered. Then, an unexpected voice broke the silence. It was Lena, her voice coming over the intercom from the ship's communications system. "Harper, you're running out of time. The Galaxians are preparing to retaliate. They're looking for a reason to wipe you out." Riley glanced up at the ceiling, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" Lena's voice crackled with urgency. "You've done what we needed. The Galaxians are on the edge. But they won't stay there for long. You've made them question everything, but now they'll come for you." The room tensed as Riley turned his attention back to the High Command. Strax was still seething, but there was something more dangerous in his eyes now, a sense of desperation. The Galaxians weren't used to feeling threatened. And when they were, they responded with violence. "I have to go," Riley said, his voice steady but firm. He reached for the container of coffee and began to walk toward the door. "But I've done what I came here to do. It's up to you now. You'll regret this," Strax warned, his voice low and dangerous. Riley stopped just before the door. "I doubt it," he said, his gaze lingering on the commander. "You've already lost. You just don't know it yet." With that, Riley left the command room, his boots clicking against the metal floor as he made his way back to the ship. Behind him, the Galaxians were left to wrestle with their thoughts, their empire teetering on the edge of collapse. As Riley strapped himself into the cockpit, his heart was still pounding in his chest. The coffee had done its job. It had shattered their sense of invincibility, opened a crack in their armor. But it wasn't enough yet. The real battle was still ahead, and the Galaxians weren't going to give up easily. But for the first time in a long while, Riley felt a spark of hope. Riley's hands shook as he tightened the straps on his seat. His heart pounded in his chest, louder than the hum of the ship's engines. He had done what he could. The coffee had done its part. But the Galaxians, now fractured and vulnerable, were still a threat. Their empire was built on violence and control, and he knew they wouldn't let go of it easily. The comms crackled again, Lena's voice cutting through the static. "Harper, they've mobilized. We have a fleet incoming." Riley's eyes flicked to the small screen in front of him. Sure enough, the display showed the sleek, angular ships of the Galaxian fleet slowly converging on his position. The enormous space station, the heart of their command, was bristling with weaponry, its massive guns locking onto his ship. "Great," Riley muttered under his breath. "Didn't think they'd take this lying down." "Not likely," Lena responded. "But we've done what we set out to do. You've cracked their facade. You've made them doubt everything they believed. That's a win, Harper. Now get out of there." Riley gritted his teeth. He couldn't leave, not yet. The stakes were too high. The Galaxians weren't just a military threat. They were a reminder of everything humanity had lost, everything Earth had fought to preserve. If he ran now, if he left them to recover, they would rebuild, and the cycle of oppression would continue. "I'm not leaving yet, Lena," Riley said, his tone cold, almost detached. "I came for a reason. To show them they're not invincible. To show them they can bleed. And now I'm going to make sure they remember it." The comms went silent, but Riley knew Lena didn't need to say anything. She understood. She always did. The Galaxian fleet was closing in fast. Riley's ship, a civilian model with only minimal weaponry, wasn't designed for a fight. But that didn't matter. This wasn't about guns or missiles. This was about proving something. The coffee had cracked their minds, yes, but now he needed to finish the job. He needed to leave a mark, a permanent one. His fingers hovered over the controls as he ran through the calculations in his mind. The Galaxian ships were fast, but they were methodical, calculating in their approach. They hadn't made the jump to full aggression yet. Strax's earlier instability was still having an effect, but that wouldn't last forever. They would regroup and attack soon enough. He had to act quickly. "Lena!" Riley called out, his voice steady but urgent. Get the ship's coordinates to the Resistance. I need a clear path. They're ready, Lena replied, her voice calm. We've been monitoring their movements. They won't catch you off guard. Riley nodded, taking one last look at the screen. The Galician ships were almost on top of him now. He slammed his fist on the console, sending the ship into a high-speed evasive maneuver. The vessel jerked as it shot forward, dodging the first barrage of enemy fire. But it was too close. He could see their guns charging, their weapons powering up. He wasn't fast enough to outrun them. But he didn't need to. The ship lurched as Riley engaged the last of his weapons. A low hum filled the cockpit, followed by the whine of a high-energy pulse charging. He had only one shot. The Galician fleet would likely shred his ship to pieces after that, but it didn't matter. The coffee had already planted the seed of doubt in their minds. It was time to finish what he had started. Riley sent the command to fire. The pulse shot out in a flash of light, streaking toward the Galician fleet. The shockwave hit first, like a physical blow. The shock didn't just fry their shields, it sent a ripple through the Galician ship's systems, scrambling their sensors and communications. Riley had engineered it specifically to cause confusion, not destruction. The ships didn't explode, but they couldn't track him anymore. The collective focus of the fleet was shattered, their movements erratic. He needed this moment. The Galaxians were no longer a unified force, they were scattered, grasping for control. Riley took his shot, using the disarray to his advantage. He veered toward the outer rim of the fleet, ducking under a massive destroyer that had begun turning too late to intercept him. The Galaxians weren't done. They began regrouping, realigning their weapons. The attack was imminent, but they didn't understand. They didn't see the bigger picture. Riley flipped a switch. Lena, now. There was a brief pause before the response came through. Coordinates locked. You're clear. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place. As the Galaxians began to retarget their weapons, Riley opened the final channel. The comms crackled to life, and his voice, clear and steady, echoed through their fleet. This is Earth. Riley's voice rang out. This is humanity. This is what you feared. You think you can crush us with your weapons and your so-called superiority. But in the end, it's your mind that is your greatest weakness. And no matter how much you try to erase it, the human spirit will always find a way to survive. We're not afraid anymore. The Galaxians, unable to respond in time, were left stunned, their fleets in disarray. Riley could see the faint flicker of doubt growing in the corner of his screen. They had expected him to be defeated. They had expected him to be crushed under their might. But he had turned their own arrogance against them, using their own minds as the weapon. The sudden silence from the fleet was deafening. Riley didn't wait. He hit the thrusters, sending the ship into a sharp turn that propelled him back toward the Resistance's safe zone. The Galaxians were no longer focused on him. They were focused on the cracks in their own empire. Riley glanced at the comms one last time. The fleet was retreating, not out of fear, but because they were unsure. The Galaxians were powerful, but they had never had to question their own invincibility. And that had changed today. He let out a long breath, finally relaxing into his seat as the ship accelerated towards safety. The battle wasn't over, not yet. But for the first time, the Galaxians knew that they were not the unstoppable force they once believed. Humanity had shown them that there was always something more, something they could never predict, something they could never understand. And that was enough.